Chapter 19 discusses U.S. involvement in World War I, and the important thing to make the connection here is that while the United States had for a long time prided itself on remaining neutral in foreign affairs ever since Washington suggested such in his farewell address, after having held to that throughout his presidency, the United States off and on is involved in global affairs, and it isn't really until after World War II that the United States fully abandons neutrality and isolationism. But there were periods such as the Spanish-American War, which we have already discussed, and here, World War I, where the United States needs to involve itself in global affairs. One of the reasons that the rest of the world turns to the United States during World War I is because we, whether we like it or not, had inserted ourselves into global affairs via American imperialism and opening markets around the world. And yes, the Spanish-American War is included in that story. So the United States, for better or worse, is more involved than ever before in foreign affairs. And so when things are not looking good in Europe for the Allied powers, they really do kind of turn to the United States as well, you're involved in global affairs, what are you going to do to help us now? So let's get started, though, with the basic causes of World War I. How did World War I break out even prior to U.S. involvement? And I will do this relatively quickly because I know you already learned this in global history, and it's not an integral part of American involvement and American history. This is more of a world history topic. So these causes are alliance systems, like the Triple Alliance and Triple Entente. If you notice the Triple Alliance, these are all nations, particularly Germany, in the center of Europe. So they viewed themselves as surrounded by their adversaries, such as Britain, France, and Russia, that made up the Triple Entente. So those are that is one of the biggest long-term causes. The immediate cause is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. He was the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and a Serbian nationalist by the name of Gavrilo Princip assassinates him. Austria-Hungary mobilizes their army for an invasion of Serbia. Well, Russia, which allies itself with Serbia, responds with mobilizing its military against Austria-Hungary. Germany responds to Russia by mobilizing its army. Soon, both alliance systems are fully mobilized and ready for war, and there is a full-scale war underway. And you can see at the beginning of war in 1914, before anybody conquered any territories anywhere, these are your alliance systems. And so you've got the green Allied powers, the pink Central powers, and then you had some neutral nations that wished not to involve themselves, but this is one of the deadliest events in human history. Now, how do you remember some of these major causes? Well, there's this acronym MAIN: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And again, this is something you've learned in the past, so I will be very, very brief with this and more or less skip over it, but it is a good reminder, nonetheless, of what you've learned in the past and linking it to this course now. So, the U.S. remains neutral in the beginning. That is traditional foreign policy. Eventually, though, numerous issues get the U.S. involved. First of all, like I mentioned before, you have European nations turning to the United States and more or less saying, what are you going to do to help us? But there were things that nudged the American people and American leadership in the direction of involving themselves in the war. Unrestricted submarine warfare. So German U-boats would sink U.S. Trading vessels that were entering British waters. This paused for a period of time, and then when it resumed, the American people really were quite angry, as was American leadership, and this is one of the big reasons that led to us getting involved. You also had the Zimmerman telegram. This is very, very angering to American citizens when they hear that German diplomats were trying to convince Mexico to declare war on the United States to keep us preoccupied in our own hemisphere, and were promising support to Mexico to reconquer parts of the territory lost in the Mexican-American War in the 1800s. And so this really riled people up. And then when the Bolshevik Revolution happens in Russia, and the Bolsheviks pull Russia out of the war, that makes Britain and France extremely vulnerable. Germany is now only required to fight a one-front war. I will go back to the map of the war at its onset. If you take Russia, and therefore really its major allies, out of the war effort, Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire really only have to address Britain and France. So this is a big issue, and people feared that this could mean German and Austrian victory in the war. So the U.S., its opinion starts to shift, and people begin mobilizing for war, more or less accepting the fact that it's inevitable that the United States will need to get involved. So first things first, you have a lot of propaganda, but you also have factories getting ready for war, women and minorities filling the void of men going to Europe by working in those factories. Food supplies and other things like fuel are rationed to help support the troops. But probably the biggest element to swaying public opinion are propaganda posters like this that depict the German King Kong character here. And you can tell it's German based on the German-style helmet. And prevent this from coming to American shores. Enlist and let's go defeat them in Europe. Now, how do they help win the war? Well, American troops help with the last big push. World War I, as you've learned before, was fought, with trench warfare. And so people hid out in the trenches, as you can see in this photo here, and occasionally one side or the other might get up and try to rush the enemy and go out into what was known as no man's land that was covered with landmines. New inventions like the machine gun that were actually meant to be an offensive weapon were used defensively by those that remained in their trenches, and so they would just mow down the enemy with machine gun fire. So those that weren't getting destroyed by landmines were then mowed down by machine guns. So trench warfare is extremely deadly, and I would make the comparison, if you remember, to our discussion of the mini ball and its invention in the Civil War. This invention of the machine gun, other technologies had a little bit less of an impact, like the first tanks, the first airplanes used in full scale in war, and those things had a lesser effect. It's really the machine gun and the tactic, the strategy of using trench warfare that was equally as deadly for World War I as the mini ball was for the Civil War. Tactics were not catching up to the new technologies. You can see this image here of a trench system. So if this barbed wire fence line here is your front line, shall we say, and you might have a forward listening post person who can run through the trench back to the main line to inform of the enemy's coming or something like that. And then there's the extensive tunnel system to try to keep safe in the trenches. Well, then eventually one side or the other is going to make their way out into no man's land. And you can see just steaming of a landmine, more barbed wire that has been placed by the enemy. And this is obviously a shrunken down version that would be a lot further before you got to the enemy's barbed wire. But you can see this is very, very deadly. After the last big push and American reinforcements helps win the war, now let's make the peace. The war is over, let's make the peace. And Woodrow Wilson takes a very Abraham Lincoln type approach to peace in the post-war world. He thinks that things should be more open, but he also thinks that the enemy shouldn't be punished necessarily, deeply and badly punished. The openness that he's talking about is things like the practice of secret treaties, ending that. Also, every nation had a right to freedom of the seas. So the issue of unrestricted submarine warfare had dragged the United States into the war, and Wilson said perhaps that wouldn't have happened, and perhaps it won't happen to others if we can all respect each other's right to freedom of the seas. We all have a right to send ships around the world to trade goods. And then more to the military side of things. Let's stop stockpiling weapons. Everybody, not just our adversaries. Let's change borders of European nations like the Austro-Hungarian Empire and break it up into two separate nations. Let the people living in those nations decide their political fate. Establish the League of Nations as a body of nations that would help keep the peace in the world. I'll come back to this in a moment. And let's place European colonies under control of the League of Nations, and this will prevent a lot of future conflicts between the major powers in the world. So in the final version of Wilson's 14 points, after discussed by the Allied powers, the Treaty of Versailles is signed in 1919, and Wilson's fair peace is rejected by nations like Britain and France, who had fought the entire war, had suffered greatly in the war. So in the end, revenge is a part of the terms. And again, this should sound very familiar to the Reconstruction era, and after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the radical Republicans putting a very punishing peace to the South. This punishing peace is put on primarily Germany, but also Austria-Hungary. Germany and Austria-Hungary had to accept full responsibility for the war. And again, it's mostly Germany that would be forced to pay massive war reparations, which are just debt payments to the Allied powers to pay for the costs of the war. And these were absolutely crushing. Now, the terms were so forced upon the Germans that it left a very, very bitter taste in their mouth and led to the rise of Adolf Hitler later. If you notice in this photo from the Versailles negotiations, you have members from the Allied nations that are sitting at conference tables and discussing with each other, and the representatives from Germany were made to stand in the back of the room. They were not, quite literally, not given a seat at the table. Now, probably the biggest component of the Treaty of Versailles is the League of Nations, as far as preventing future war. Wilson is met with resistance back at home among Republicans, particularly Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts. They didn't like the language that said that League of Nations members would protect and defend each other. To them, it sounded like an alliance structure. And so the Henry Cabot Lodge version of this put in language that would assure the U.S. wouldn't be drawn into another war. Now, Wilson encouraged Democrats to vote against the Lodge version of the treaty. This made the two-thirds majority vote to approve a treaty impossible. So in the end, the U.S. is the only nation not to approve of the League of Nations, even though its own president proposed the idea. And as much as Lodge raising objections certainly had something to do with it, Wilson was rather stubborn and didn't want any changes to the language of the treaty, or the U.S. approval of the treaty. So it's really a two-sided reason why this failed. The draft is very controversial during the war. 2.3 million people, men, are drafted into the Army from the beginning of U.S. involvement through the end of the war. The Selective Service Act is passed in May of 1917, and the period between then and the end of the war, 2.3 million people are drafted. And this is very controversial because not everybody is capable of killing another person, even if it is in a war and considered a justifiable action. Some people resisted this, and therefore laws like the Espionage Act and Sedition Act were passed to control any speaking out against the war effort. Both acts are putting very, very heavy fines and sometimes prison sentences for crimes like spying, interfering with recruitment of soldiers. That will be an important one. We will come back here in a moment and discuss this in more detail. Speaking against the government's efforts to sell war bonds, very similar to this, speaking against recruitment. Urging resistance to any U.S. laws. This is pretty controversial because people have free speech rights, and as long as you're not speaking against the war effort, maybe you're complaining about segregation laws in the South. Well, according to the language of the Espionage and Sedition Acts, you could be thrown into prison for that. So this is a very controversial part of this. And here's a quote: using disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the U.S. government, flag, or military. Again, who gets to decide what is profane, what is abusive in the law? And lastly, that the U.S. Post Office could destroy anti-war mailings if they wanted to. Now, Eugene V. Debs, who was actually a presidential candidate multiple times, was head of the Socialist Party in the United States. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for making an anti-war speech. And here is an image of Eugene V. Debs. And even more famous an example of civil liberties being limited during wartime is Charles Shank. Charles Shank mailed, so that's an important piece to this, about 15,000 leaflets to men who had been drafted into the Army and encouraged them to resist the draft, to not join the war effort. He was arrested and convicted under the Espionage Act. He appealed all the way to the Supreme Court and saying it was his free speech rights to speak out against the Selective Service Act and to encourage others to speak out as well. The court upheld his conviction and said that the Espionage Act made his imprisonment constitutional because he presented a clear and present danger to the United States national security. That is a clause included in the Constitution that they used to justify this. Now, wording that the Regents exam likes to use for this, and we will learn infringement of civil liberties during wartime again when we discuss World War II and another case, Korematsu versus U.S., but the wording that the Regents exam in New York State likes to use for both Shank and Korematsu, which I said we'll learn about in the future, is that civil liberties are not absolute. That's one term, or one phrase they like to use. That civil liberties can be limited during wartime. That's another phrase. and then this phrase of clear and present danger, the clear and present danger clause to the Constitution. So Shank versus U.S., very, very important Supreme Court case to know. After the war is over, the Russian Revolution had riled up people's fear of communism and that it would expand around the world, maybe even make its way to the United States. Attorney General at the time, A. Mitchell Palmer, he's pictured here to the right, authorized raids against immigrants suspected of disloyalty and perhaps being communists throughout 1919 and 1920. Before the end of the raids, over 600 people are deported, and they're called Reds. So really, it's just radical thinkers who scared the government and the American people and were deported as a result. So probably not something you would see happen today, especially in our mass media society. This would be exposed and spoken out against rather quickly. But A. Mitchell Palmer and the Palmer raids, quite famous historically in the really beginning of the Red Scare that pops back up after World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. That is the end of the Chapter 19 lecture. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, I will see you in class.